Hello, I'm Alex Kaiser, and today I'm going to be presenting on the Sea Peoples and the Late Bronze Age collapse. So, the Late Bronze Age saw the rise of really the world's first empires with the organization of labor and the rise of productive agriculture. The first empires really started to pop up, and they were reliant on strong central governments and integrated state religions. Um, and this was a time of relative peace at around 1200 BCE. And these empires were strongly dependent on international trade. So there was huge networks of pretty intricate and delicate systems of trade going on between the governments, and really these were necessary for fueling the economy as copper and tin, which were essential to the Bronze Age, really occurs sparsely across the Mediterranean and Middle East. So Cyprus was a big hub of copper, and then all the sources of tin were quite far away. And so you see this delicate and interconnected system of really the first empires, which are kind of figuring it out as they go along. And so at around 1200 BC, within the span of generation, this whole system of empires effectively collapses, all in the span of one generation. And so there's several factors to this. And the first of these being really starting with the series of natural disasters in Europe and the subsequent collapse of the Mycenaean Empire. And so to start this out, entering at around 1250 BCE, the Mediterranean starts to undergo a changing climate. So this results in a dry spell as the Mediterranean cools down and there's a significant drop off in the amount of rain across the Mediterranean. And so agricultural collapse and famine occur across the Mediterranean, and it's particularly acute in Northern Europe. And so compounding this is a series of earthquake clusters that occur in Greece and Anatolia, kind of around the Aegean, for about 50 years, starting at around 1225. And so this leads to quite a bit of widespread destruction and depopulation of cities. And so this triggers pretty much the collapse of the Mycenaean Empire as the administration and economic structures fall apart with the collapse of the ruling class. And with it, that collapse comes along basically degradation of territorial control. They no longer control an empire anymore. And that leads to a collapse in international trade as they're no longer interacting with any of the major powers. And since it's no longer needed to organize the state, you see a sharp decrease in the amount of writing in this area. And so these series of natural disasters trigger quite a large mass displacement of people in the northern Mediterranean. And so this is where the term the Sea Peoples comes in, as pretty much most of the seafaring population in northern Europe and the Mediterranean islands basically need to or cannot live in their nations anymore as these start to fall apart. And so as Mycenae collapses, there's a whole bunch of people displaced across the Mediterranean. And so you see people from like the Aegean in Greece, islands in Sicily. You see the Philistines, Sardinia, Teretian people in Troy, more people from Greece, all the different regions of Greece. You see people from Anatolia being displaced, and kind of as a result of the Mycenaean collapse, you see this potential for a slave uprising. Though that's a little bit debated, and all of these are pretty rough estimates of where these people are. There's not a huge amount of evidence, and what evidence there is quite confusing. So these are some of the best guesses of what these people or where these people originated. So these Sea Peoples displaced ended up creating somewhat of a loose confederacy in the Aegean here. And so for a while, they sort of pitter about these islands and start, as Mycenae starts to fall apart, this becomes an increasingly dire situation. More and more people are being displaced and forced to migrate. And so in this quite broad counterclockwise sweeping action, the Sea Peoples, this loose confederation, pretty much all across. So from Western Mediterranean to the Aegean, all of these people are displaced as maybe the islands that they're living on are no longer able to support their populations with the decrease in rainfall and subsequent food. And compounding out of the natural disasters that are hitting this area. So there's a mass collapse of the Mycenaean system. And as a result, there's a huge displacement of people. And so, as you can see, they form somewhat of a loose coalition in the Aegean in these islands, and then they very, very quickly start sweeping basically in a clockwise manner around the Mediterranean or the Eastern Mediterranean. And so this is where the term Sea Peoples really comes in. Is it's a huge sweeping invasion basically all across the Mediterranean in every single one of these empires, and the destruction that's caused by this is pretty catastrophic. So here's an excellent relief by Ramses III. He's up here in this top right corner, and this is depicting, I believe, a battle in the mouth of the Nile where Egyptians created a series of blocking archer ships. You can kind of see this in the center of the relief, and against this horde of onslaught of Sea Peoples. And you can see even in this relief here, which is quite excellently carved, each of the different Sea Peoples has different characteristics, and so you see different helmets, different clothes or lack of clothes, different shields, spears, and so there's a depicted and described as a great variety of people. So these people came pretty much all at once in the span of just over 30 years. So it's a huge outflux of people from the Mediterranean into the Eastern Mediterranean as they're looking for places to live and settle. And so they bring pretty much everything they own along with them. But in this process, they basically brought destruction to the entire Eastern Mediterranean. And so Ramses II or III called these a conspiracy in their islands. And so this ends up triggering the collapse of basically nearly every civilization. So Greece or I guess Mycenae starts really first, with the coastal cities burned, inland palaces destroyed, and then with the collapse of the ruling class, potentially the Doric people, as it aligns somewhat with the nomenclature of slaves in their language, possibly started an uprising, destroying the rest of any shred of civilization, and then very quickly begin to migrate outwards and form coalitions in the Mediterranean. And so the next place that they arrive at is Anatolia. So this is the Hittite Empire and the Arzawa, a little bit to their west, on the Aegean. And so this completely collapses. Nearly every single major city is destroyed and burned, especially along the coast. Troy is burned and the capital is abandoned. And so the Hittite Empire really kind of collapses catastrophically. And so alongside this is the collapse of Cyprus. So Cyprus is one of the main copper sources for Bronze Age Mediterranean civilizations, as it's not a very common metal in the Earth's crust. And so there's very select places that can find it. And this is especially the case with tin, the other alloy component in bronze. And it occurs much, much less frequently than even copper. So the main sources for tin are quite far, usually in like Afghanistan or even like Cornwall in Britain. And so the trade routes for tin are especially fragile. And so combine that with the collapse of the copper sources in the Mediterranean and difficulty getting tin as the geopolitical situation kind of unfurls. And so basically the engine of the Bronze Age, copper and tin alloyed to make bronze, is no longer readily accessible to these empires. So that's another major issue with the collapse of international trade. And so as we keep going down clockwise along the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria's next, and so kind of in the area between in the Levant where the Hittites and Egyptians were feuding for quite a while. The Kadesh people there, that collapses. Babylon in Mesopotamia especially collapses. Egypt is barely able to survive. Ramses III puts up a concerted defense of Egypt, and that, along with settling and hiring the Sea Peoples as mercenaries, is able to defend Egypt. But it never really fully recovers from this and kind of falls into infighting and never really attains the status as a large empire. Assyria survives. They would basically be the hub of where the Iron Age would start up. Iron smelting would become quite developed in Assyria after this period. And so this would allow the Assyrians to quite quickly, after everything settles and has become a little more stable, is able to kind of expand outward and conquer with the technology granted by iron. And then Elam also survives a little bit as Babylon next to it falls. And so pretty much every single major city to the north and in the northeastern Mediterranean is almost completely destroyed. Particularly in the Hittite Empire, closest to some of the people displaced from land and having to deal with the invasions from sea, completely falls apart into some Neo-Hittite empire. Cyprus is completely abandoned. The Levant is pretty much destroyed and resettled by the sea peoples. And then Egypt has to sort of, it almost implodes. It no longer has its large territory in the Levant and kind of splits between north and south for quite a while, as they're also being pressured by the Libyans from the east, or from the west, sorry. And so overall, this is a great example of kind of the systems collapse theory. So the system collapse theory kind of explains why it was such a brilliant and dramatic collapse of these empires. It's not one issue. It's not just the sea people running basically over these nations and burning everything in their wake. Under normal circumstances, any one of these empires may have been able to deal with the migration and destruction wrought by the sea people. However, this was not, that was all that was going on. So while you have that environmental emergency in Northern Europe and the series of earthquakes that are hitting the Aegean, triggering this mass migration, alongside that in the Eastern Mediterranean, you have the climatic dry spell, which decreases rainfall significantly. And this water shortage leads to widespread famine, which is the basis for these new empires and civilizations, is the ability to have sustainable, widespread, and productive agriculture. And when this sort of fails, you see depopulation of key cities, massive internal stability as the ruling class collapses, and the collapse in international trade, which is essential to basically the technological engine of these empires, as bronze is no longer able to be acquired, and nations that may need food imported from, say, like the breadbaskets of Egypt in the Nile with its reliable flooding, that's not able to traverse the Mediterranean. So other civilizations surrounding Egypt collapse as well. And so basically it's this coalescence of events that all happen all at once at around 1200 BCE. So between 1225 and I believe 1177, there's pretty much an entire collapse of the Mediterranean civilizations, or the empires, I guess would be the case. And so this is what really the map looks like after the collapse, or the Bronze Age collapse, and the sea people come sweeping through. And so really only Assyria, Elam, kind of insulated from quite far away from the coast, survives. And then Egypt, due to the defense of Ramses II, massively contracts, but is able to survive, although it remains a second-rate power for pretty much the rest of its existence. And so it would be this power vacuum and kind of the inability to access tin and bronze that drive this Iron Age, that necessitates the technological development of iron smelting. So it's a whole new resource that is far superior and is, more importantly, much more readily available pretty much everywhere you go. And so the start of the Iron Age really begins, and this is where we see the rise of the Assyrian Empire, taking over pretty much the entire Middle East and North Africa. And so this collapse and the power vacuum, as well as the technological collapse, no longer able to access the key materials needed to make bronze, from like copper from Cyprus and tin from Afghanistan, farther north in, say, like Britain, and much smaller sources in the Eastern or Western Mediterranean. Without access to those, with the collapse of international trade, iron, which is much more readily available pretty much everywhere you go, becomes the de facto resource, which ends up being a fortuitous decision, as the Iron Age basically allows for the proliferation of much more modern technologies and agricultural revolutions. So the Bronze Age collapse is really a coalescence of events that kind of culminates with the displacement and then subsequent invasion of the sea peoples. And so it's this whole system of things that all go wrong all at once that leads to these quite dramatic collapses. And so it's a quite interesting little area of history. So here are the sources that I used. Thank you very much.